Hello and welcome to EDSE 457 session 11. This is Communicating Meaning, part 1, Speaking and Listening. And I apologize in advance for my voice. It's not great, so we'll see how long that lasts during lecture. Following this part of lecture, you should be able to communicate the importance of integrating speaking and listening opportunities into your classroom and be able to discuss one way in which you will scaffold and support the development of student speaking and listening skills. So the Common Core standards say a lot about communicating meaning through speaking and listening. And I'm just going to preview some of the ways that speaking and listening are included in the standards. So one of those ways is for students to be able to initiate and participate in a range of collaborative discussions with diverse partners on various topics, text, issues. In addition to participating, they're also are building on others' ideas and expressing their own ideas clearly and persuasively. Students also need to be able to integrate multiple credible sources of information into multimodal presentations and evaluate a speaker's point of view, reasoning, uses of evidence, and rhetorical strategies, as well as being able to identify fallacious reasoning or exaggerated evidence. This is really important in interacting with fake news and alternative facts. Students also need to know how to present information, findings, and support evidence clearly, concisely, and logically, with strong organization, development, substance, and style appropriate to purpose, task, and audience. So in the next part of lecture, we're going to talk about writing, but when we think about it, the last slide talked about interactive communication and listening, right? And this slide, this first point of this slide really talks about formal presentations and what it's like to almost give an oral essay of a certain. Students also need to be able to make strategic use of digital media to enhance presentations, which ties to last session in the use of 21st century and technology skills. And they need to be able to adapt their speech to a variety of contexts and tasks, demonstrating command of formal English as appropriate. So you wouldn't necessarily read a spoken word piece or present on global warming in the same way that you would presenting a persuasive rhetorical speech, trying to convince somebody to follow your political platform, for example. And so students need to understand that speaking comes in many genres, just as writing. So how can we promote speaking and listening in ways that also promote student development? So I think the number one thing that we can do as teachers is provide scaffolding and opportunities for practice. So we can structure regular opportunities for discussion in multiple formats, and that includes pairs, small groups, teacher-initiated discussions, and student-generated conversations, as well as whole class discussion. We want to help students prepare for discussions with clear task awareness for text interactions. So this goes back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago when we were talking about giving students a purpose for reading text. If they know that they're going to need to discuss these points, asking specific questions that help them to prepare for your later discussions. We also want to model effective presentations. So we want to use visuals in our PowerPoint slides and bullets and not make things text dense so that students understand how a PowerPoint or how a presentation gets put together visually, but also how presentations get put together when we're talking and trying to engage our audience. I think it's important to give rubrics of appropriate complexity to evaluate point of view, rhetorical strategy use, and reasoning. So students know what they're looking for, right? And know what they need to include. So you can give self-check rubrics for students who are preparing presentations, but also part of the standards you saw were listening and being able to evaluate point of view and rhetorical strategy use. And so it's important to give students rubrics so they know what they're evaluating. Some more ideas for scaffolding and opportunities for practice in terms of presentations. You can introduce presentation guidelines from the beginning of the year and assess without evaluating initially students on these every time they present. So every time a student goes in front of the class, you can give feedback, but that feedback doesn't necessarily need to be tied to a grade. So you can say, that the student made strong eye contact, or that the pacing was appropriate, or that the volume needed to be a little bit higher. You can give these opportunities for feedback and practice so that students can continually progress. If students are only giving 1 to 2 presentations a year in their English class, for example, they're not really having authentic opportunities for practice in presentation that will allow them to meet those standards. As I just was talking about, this is why it's important for us to give opportunities for various genres of presentation across content areas. So, really thinking about what are the ways that people present their work in your content area and how can you give students opportunities to do that. We also need to model the integration of digital media into our own presentations and lectures, right? So figuring out how do we embed a movie? How do we embed music? How do we create digital stories? So it's part of our work as lifelong learners to model these new types of presentation literacy for our students. And finally, we can help students prepare for discussions and presentations with academic sentence frames, which I'm going to give you a few examples of in the next slide. So it's really important for us to use scaffolding when we want to communicate with academic language. And sentence stems or sentence frames can be powerful scaffolding tools for communication using academic language. So these are a few examples of some sentence stems and sentence frames to get your mind going on these frames. These are not the be all and end all of sentence stems, but I think they're helpful to guide students in using academic language and structuring their sentences academically. And you might consider giving students a bank of sentence stems or frames for discussion or regular journal assignments and especially for presentation. So that's the end of this part of lecture. You should be able to communicate the importance of integrating speaking and listening opportunities into your classroom and discuss at least one way in which you can scaffold and support the development of student speaking and listening skills. Hopefully my voice holds up for the second part of lecture, and I will see you then.